everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on human cloning. I want to give the good things that we are doing research with the Nanjing University, China, and they want to invite both David Smith and Professor Rob for joining in our team as an advisor for this research. So hopefully this dialogue will be very helpful. It will be very much academic and industry oriented discussions. So hopefully it will be helpful for our audience. Mr. Robin Daly, what you want to discuss about human cloning?
Well, let's open with some of the reasons why you want to do human cloning. Much of the medical testing we do with drugs, cosmetics, foods, especially manufactured foods, is done with animals, and animals, certain kinds of animals, monkeys, mice, um, dogs, have been used historically for this testing. And you could argue in some cases it's inhumane for the animals, but we do make a significant amount of progress with regard to how these things work with humans. And so we rationalize what is pretty much the abuse of animals in the name of science and to help humanity. Moving towards human cloning, we could create constructs that are not necessarily human. In other words, human skin, human organs, parts of human bodies that are not sentient by any stretch of the imagination, but that would be far more effective for medical testing than animals are. Wouldn't have the ethical issues of testing on animals or the ethical issues of testing on humans, and yet would provide much higher, much more effective, much more accurate results potentially than the testing on animals would provide. So better ethically from the standpoint of animal abuse, better medically from the standpoint of accuracy. And also when we get to a point of being able to clone organs and better understand the organs, you can do a better job with transplants, because transplants, while we've made a tremendous strides with regard to transplants, we still have significant problems with bodies rejecting the transplant and the transplant organ not surviving the post procedure in the body. Yet if we could clone an individual's organ and replace it, or take a damaged organ, modify it with something like CRISPR, and grow it that way to fix a genetic defect, we could far better correct some of these genetic problems or historical problems people had. We just lost an entertainer this last week for liver failure because of his excess alcohol use. It's certainly very possible that we could have cloned a new liver for him and transplanted the liver, and he'd still be alive and functioning, and recognize that we have no way to bring somebody back from death. So our efforts now need to be to preserve life. And one of the groups that this would most benefit would be the military folks that have been catastrophically harmed as a result of an explosion or any other aspect of their military life. There's a pretty good chance we could restore them to full functionality, as opposed to using prosthetics to get them to 10, 20, 25% functionality. And even as we talk about prosthetics, being able to create biological links for those prosthetics would make them far more effective. We're working on that now, but we're hampered by the fact we kind of have to work on living people to do that, and it limits our range of experimentation, because you don't want to generate a ton of pain, or you don't want to do harm to a living person. But if you could create or grow a shoulder, or you could create or grow an arm, you could better understand how that arm interrelates with the rest of the body while it's still functioning, without dissecting a living person. You could do it on the table with just the parts of the body that you needed to work on. So from a scientific standpoint, being able to clone organs or having the capability of cloning a person could be hugely beneficial if the technology wasn't misused. And I'll leave it there, so I pass to David, and then next go around we'll talk a little bit about how the technology could be misused and what we might want to avoid. David, you're on.
Mr. David Smith.
David looks like he's frozen. So we're waiting
I
for
think
David.
Mr. David has the internet problem.
Yeah, he's having an internet problem. So let's go with some of the downsides to cloning, and that really comes down to abuse. We have a lot of abuse going on in the organ business to begin with. I remember when I went on a trip to Eastern Europe, being told there were certain parts of the town I shouldn't walk in because I'd wake up in a bathtub full of ice, missing a kidney. And while I kind of think they were joking at the time, the fact of the matter is the illicit use of organs and organ sales has been problematic for the industry. And clearly, you could have a serious problem with regard to cloning that would in some cases it would mitigate it, because the cloned organs would be cheaper and would reduce the opportunity to steal organs from somebody else or pay somebody else to take their organs and leave them sick and dying. But on the other hand, if an illicit entity were to begin cloning organs, the quality of the organs could degrade, and you could introduce new illnesses, new genetic problems into the population through the cloning process, which could be problematic. So you'd want to make sure you can maintain quality, and you'd want to make sure that the work is being done by certified, bona fide medical research facilities and wasn't going to be misused to cause harm. And of course, cloning full people can become problematic because we already have some issues with regard to dealing with artificial intelligence and what their position in the world would be. What would be the position of a cloned person? Would a cloned person have the same rights as a real person? And recognize that since we can't translate that aspect of you that is you, at least not yet, that the cloned person might look like you, might smell like you, but it wouldn't be you. It would be based on whatever life experiences that it had. And right now, our ability to transfer those life experiences is limited. Now, we could do something like, for instance, create a clone of George Washington, which was the first president we had here in the United States, and then populate it with the stories of George Washington. Basically, he would become a parody of what he was, but the clone would fit within the dialectic that was created around him. It fit within the story that we knew of the individual, and would be able to function as we thought George Washington would function. It wouldn't be the same as George Washington, but we wouldn't know the difference. And this comes down to whether we're talking about physical clones or digital clones, which is the other kind of cloning, and the kind of cloning we are very close to being able to do now. Being able to create a digital clone of someone, in other words, something that looks like, acts like, speaks like, looks like I said it before, the individual is something we can do now. We call it deepfakes. We just had an issue here in the United States where Donald Trump, our ex-president, did an interview, and a large portion of the population believed it was a deepfake. It wasn't him. Turned out at least it came. It's not clear yet if it was him or not, but at least it came with his approval because he retweeted the interview. And it might simply be he had a cold and just sounded different. But the fact of the matter is we're at a point now where we really can't tell whether the person that's on the screen is that person or it's a deep fake. You can go on YouTube right now and you can see some of the deep fakes, especially the ones with Tom Cruise, that just look like Tom Cruise did it. I mean, just really there's no way you're going to be able to tell on a number of them that it's not Tom Cruise. But it's not. It's somebody else doing it in a deep fake overlay that makes it look exactly like Tom Cruise. And if you take the information that we know about Tom Cruise, his movies, the rest of it, we can create a simulation of Tom Cruise that probably wouldn't be Tom Cruise to anybody that knew him well. But for those of us that have seen Tom Cruise in movies, it would be more accurate representation of how we thought of Tom Cruise than Tom Cruise was, because our perceptions of Tom Cruise aren't based on how we know him. They're based on how he's acted. And so that parody of Tom Cruise, that digital twin of Tom Cruise, would be far closer to what we thought of Tom Cruise than it would be the Tom Cruise. And let's be clear, that particular parody would work better as an actor than Tom Cruise would, because the Tom Cruise has to overcome when he's playing a part that aspect of himself that's not the character. The clone wouldn't have to. The clone could simply be the character. I wouldn't have the complex. And so for the clone in the artificial environment, this metaverse environment we would create around it, that would be the movie. They would be in reality, so that their expressions, their reactions, everything would be realistic. They wouldn't be fighting their real self as opposed to their acting self, and they would simply be that real digital self. Now that creates a real issue with regard to honesty, integrity, and reality. So, because certainly with regard to actors, this would be a benefit. I mean, the being able to create actors that could better act could be a huge benefit in terms of the realism of a movie. Not great for the actors per se, but I've got a workaround for that too in a minute. But now let's talk about it in politics. In politics, you think you're voting for the person the way they are, or if you're hiring somebody, you think you're hiring somebody for who they are. But these deep fakes could create the impression during the hiring process, or let's say you're on Tinder or one of the dating sites, create an impression on one of the dating sites that you're one person that you aren't, and that first date you might be able to play the role of the person that was in the video, but chances are not long term, and you'd be misleading the person that you're dating into thinking that you are somebody you're not. This is a problem that actors actually have. A lot of times it goes back to why relationships don't work with actors. It's because the person they're having a relationship with thinks they're dating the character. They don't think they're dating the actor. And so that they consistently believe that this character they may have seen in a romantic comedy someplace, called rom-coms. A romantic comedy someplace is the person they're marrying. It's not the person they're dating and marrying is a real person. They're not a character created through the media and then through a construct. But yet it's very hard to make that delineation. But after they've been married for months to years, they recognize the person they married isn't the person they thought they were married, and the marriage falls apart. Well, the same thing can happen with politics or an employee. When you create a digital deep fake of an individual, and that digital deep fake is attending meetings for you, attending interviews for you, or showing up on a particular site trying to get you to vote for them, and it's not that person. It just happens to be a representation of that person that best appeals to what you want that person to be. We're likely to vote for them, even though they're not that person, nor will they do anything they promised they're going to do, because those promises were made by a clone, not by the individual. And we already have problems with politicians making promises they have no intention of fulfilling. This would just take that problem and explode it and make it far worse. And in fact, with deepfakes, you can do some really interesting stuff in that you could create an offer, basically an individually customized representation of the individual that was most appealing to the voter. It doesn't have to be the same. When you have a real politician on existing TV, they talk in front of the camera, that broadcast goes out to everybody that watches it. But with deepfakes and the internet, you can create a representation that takes into account who the audience is, one or more people, and recrafts itself based on what that audience wants to hear. So every individual watching that video would see the perfect politician that they just absolutely had to vote for, even though that perfect politician would have limited connection to the individual that was actually running for office. And the clone wouldn't be in Congress or in the presidency. A clone would only remain in the metaverse, which wouldn't be real. So the ability to abuse cloning technology is a problem. Where they're talking about physical cloning, where you could abuse it to create substandard parts for people or slaves, which would be a problem. The same problem we've got with potentially with autonomous machines, by the way, is this underlying concept of creating slaves and then abusing the slaves, which would be problematic, I think, for humanity. It would happen with clones. They would potentially be second-class citizens, much like folks treat illegal immigrants in many countries today, where they don't have immigration status, so they can't really rely on law enforcement to protect them. And then people abuse them because they can. Clones would potentially fall within that same unfortunate space of not being clear on whether they could be citizens or individuals. And so making sure that these human clones weren't abused would be critical. Now let's talk about David's back. I'm assuming his internet may be working now. I'm going to stop and let David speak for a moment because I've been going on for a while, and then we'll come back and talk a bit about body replacement and immortality, as cloning could have a significant impact on the amount of time we would live, and more near term, the amount of time that we appeared to live as opposed to the amount of time we actually live. But I'll cover that next time around. David Smith, you're up.
Well, sorry guys, you're right, Rob. I 100% lost internet and all my data. Um, so thank you again. I don't know what I said, but I kind of start there again. Is that there's natural cloning that we see in nature, but as we look at human cloning, there are really three different types of cloning that we see used there. We see gene cloning, reproductive cloning, and therapeutic cloning, which is kind of where Rob was talking about there. So gene cloning takes copies of the genes or segments of DNA and works from there. Reproductive cloning produces copies of whole animals, and therapeutic cloning produces embryonic stem cells that can begin to create tissue to replace injured or diseased tissue. And really, gene cloning is very different from reproductive cloning and therapeutic cloning as you begin to look across the different things. And they're done for many different purposes there. And really, if you look at the most uh, pervasive type of cloning today, it's really the ones that are looking at a cloning technique to make copies of the genes that people want to study and begin to put into other things. And in reproductive cloning, though, today, when you go back and look at things like Dolly the sheep and others, uh, they remove cells from an animal, they transfer them to a donor animal, and then begin to grow it that way and begin to see it. And over the last 50 years, uh, a lot of work has been conducted, a lot of experiments in cloning. In 1979, researchers did the first genetically identical mice by splitting the embryos in a test tube and then reproducing them. But it was not until 1996 that the first mammal was taken and done. And it was, this is a field with a lot of trials and errors still, which is some of the challenges. So when Dolly was produced, it took the Scottish researchers 276 attempts to actually produce that clone and begin to go through there. There is work being done in human cloning around the world today. We've seen them in different places. For example, South Korea claimed that they had produced a clone based off of a forced cell. Then there was another one done where they created a clone, a human clone, they said, of a girl named Eve, never fully documented, but there's just a lot of work being done in it. And as Rob said, the potential's pretty big as you begin to look at them. The place where I see the greatest use today is really when you look at therapeutic cloning, where you're creating for the purpose of producing cells with the same DNA as yourself, and they can be used at treating and understanding disease. They can be used for looking at ways, as Rob talked about earlier, growing kidneys, growing different organs in the body as we go through disease. And really, it's the potential there that I see the most capabilities going forward. And there's a lot of issues around it that we can discuss, but that is kind of where I think we are seeing part of it going today. And the other thing that we see there is what we're seeing really accelerating today is the acceptance of being able to do different types of cloning to produce different type of outputs. And there is a beginning to be a differential now between some of the ethics around the different types. There's still tremendous ethics challenges around cloning, an entire human being. In fact, most countries in the world have put restrictions on that today. And you see it, for example, in fact, about 70 countries have banned human cloning totally. And so that's kind of where we are on that side. So Sharif, I apologize for the internet outage, but I think that's a place to get started from my side.
Okay, so let's talk about.
Yes, Mr. Rob.
I'll pick up. Go ahead.
Yes, please continue. Yeah.
All right. So with cloning as it relates to immortality or long life. One of the efforts that's going on here in the world is an effort called New Beauty, and New Beauty for $8,000 a pop will give you a transfusion of blood from young people. They report as a result of this, and apparently around 100 people have done this. And the people that are doing it are 35 and older. The young blood is coming from folks that are obviously younger than 20. And the benefits have been, at least the benefits they're reporting in the trials have reported lower levels of cancer-causing carcinoembryonic antigens, lower cholesterol, and lowered Alzheimer's risk. Now that last would probably make it worthwhile for anybody that's approaching my age group. But there is a benefit. The underlying problem, of course, is you're pulling blood from somebody else. So there's a certain amount of risk that something might come through that doesn't get caught in the testing with the donor that could make you sick. Another is well, if it's $8,000 a pop to do it legitimately, how much would it be to do it illegitimately? That's a lot of money for blood. So the risk of abuse here would be significant. But if you were able to clone that blood, if you were able to create a new plasma without involving people that was effectively young blood, that didn't have the age-related degradation that blood in older bodies has, then you could get those benefits, assuming those benefits still prove to be real, without doing any harm or creating an illicit problem. And you could do it in production, which means you could probably do it for cheaper than somebody could do it illicitly, and that would prevent the illicit use of this technology, which I have no doubt is happening someplace in the world and not being reported. Because you get a benefit like that and a cost like that, and there will undoubtedly be places that will find people that are economically disadvantaged or politically disadvantaged, and will abuse those people to get the blood. So you could create cloned blood that would, to a certain extent, reverse the aging process in individuals. And then, of course, you have the cloned organs that I mentioned before to replace failing organs in the body. And if you can get down to the point of figuring out a way to replace, and we do have ways to replace bone marrow, to be able to harvest your bone marrow, reconstruct it, make it younger, put it back into your body, and extend your life that way. And of course, the final way to do it is just to create an entirely new body for you, and then transfer your mind from the old body to the new body. Now, we don't really understand the mind yet, let alone understand how we might transfer it. We do believe we're close to being able to transmit some of the knowledge in the brain. MRI tests have indicated that they can interpret now to a relatively high degree of accuracy what a person is thinking with MRI, but the problem is each test has required that machine to be calibrated for the individual. So it doesn't scale yet. It's not something you could use in court to catch a liar, for instance, unless the individual giving the testimony was willing to spend hours training the machine up front. And since that individual probably doesn't want to train the machine accuracy, the odds are that if you were to do that to an individual to get the truth, that they would compromise the training, so the machine still wouldn't catch them, is still pretty high. So we're not yet at the point to reliably transfer information, but we're on a path, and it does look like the path is viable. Just a question of how long it's going to take to get us there. But what about the ethics? So let's say you were able to transfer all your knowledge from your body to a clone body, a much younger clone body. It wouldn't be you. It would be a representative you that would be reasonably accurate, but it would still be a clone. It would be a copy. And so what would the responsibilities of the citizenship capability of the individual be that created the clone, and what would the responsibilities, the privileges, this word I was looking for, the privileges of the individual that was created? You now have two yous. Who gets your stuff? Boy, that's going to be an interesting thing that probably won't happen in my lifetime. But that's a problem that's up and coming, and it's not necessarily a problem we have to deal with now, and we don't really necessarily have to deal with the religious aspects of this, which we haven't addressed yet. This idea that cloning is somehow illicit because it's subjugating or it's compromising God's work. God should be the only one that creates people. But we kind of crossed that line a long time ago. If you're an absolutist with regard to religion, then you don't get vaccines, you don't get medical help, you don't go into surgery. And we do have religious groups that believe that strongly, and none of that stuff happens. And their life expectancies are considerably lower than the majority of the population that does not. But it shows that there's a sliding scale. And that scale changes over time. So if we were to go back into the dark ages, much of the stuff we currently do with medicine would probably have doctors burned at the stake or otherwise terminally treated as heretics and witches and warlocks. And we've gotten over that. We clearly do allow doctors to practice medicine today, and much of the work we do to create things like antivirals is done in ways that religion has objected to in the past and just lost the power over time to object to in the present. And that's likely what's going to happen to cloning. As soon as you start saving people's lives with the technology, it gets pretty hard to block it, because suddenly your religious constituency goes to where they want, at least a significant number of them, goes to where they want to live. And those that don't want to do this stuff, well, eventually a percentage of them are going to die off, and the dynamic will change, which is often the case when you have an issue of two groups, one group that supports scientific research to solve a problem and one that does not. If the problem is terminal, as it often is with illnesses, and certainly is with physical death, the problem does self-correct over a period of time, because the people that don't want to do it die out, and they're replaced by people that are probably going to be more open to it, because they'll be surrounded by people that are actually using the technology and benefiting from it. And it's pretty hard to argue against a technology that's resulting in, your child living where otherwise your child would die, your spouse living where otherwise your spouse would die, or your parents living where otherwise they would die. So the momentum is towards cloning, clearly, and I personally don't think it can be blocked. It can be slowed, and clearly that's what's happening now. But it can't be blocked. And in geographies where religion doesn't have as strong a say, then you get much more advancement. And you certainly are going to find that when those kinds of capabilities are created, people from the constricted environment that doesn't allow the technology will migrate either temporarily or permanently to the environment that will allow them to live. And that's just natural. If you can't get a procedure that you need done, say in the United States, and you want that procedure done, you're going to go to Mexico, you're going to go to South America, you might even go to Eastern Europe to have the procedure done, because you believe that's going to make you better. And in the case of cloning, it very well could. So with the adoption of a cloned organ or artificial blood, or any one of those, a number of procedures that we're capable of doing right now, and making it work. In fact, there's little doubt in my mind that in some places in the world, a lot of this is already happening, and just they're not publicizing it broadly because they just don't want to deal with the backlash. So that's kind of where we are, and much of this could be modeled digitally now, because we're advancing far quicker with digital clones than we are with physical clones. And so that means with digital clones, we can explore a lot of this stuff without actually using biological technology and running into issues with religion. Because right now, at least as far as I can tell, a religion isn't against people creating avatars. Maybe in the future. But at least there's no large movement against creating a realistic avatar. We are going to have issues with regard to avatars as well, and we'll get to that later. I'm going to pass over to David because the stuff seems to still be working, and I'm sure he has something to say here.
Well, I'm hoping it's still working. And I just wish I had more carriers out in my neighborhood than I have. Not a good commercial for Spectrum. The other thing is you begin to see in there is that, scientists have cloned many mammals so far. They've cloned cattle, goats, rabbits, cats, dogs. But, humans haven't made that list yet. And there's some real interesting things there, because if I look at this, some of the issues, as Rob was talking, are social risks, psychological risks, physiology risks, really, because you see mutations happening as you clone all the time. That's why most identical are not identical by the time they come out with. At the mammal stage, there's a high likelihood still of loss of life, and it puts there in that some of the developmental mutations are ones that can actually shorten life. What we've seen is, compared to in some animals from the original and the clone, oftentimes the clone has a shorter life cycle than the original, and that is one of the things that we need to do a lot more research around in understanding those. And yes, there's one of the other things is that some of the early promises in cloning was to be used as research, because Rob has stated, I agree with him, that our digital twins and our modeling simulation has gone that to such that we can do more and more of that in the digital world and less of that in the physical world. And we're seeing that in things like drug discovery and other things today being used all the time. And because of that, the promise of human cloning has become a little less interesting to a lot of scientists than it was there for a while. And you're seeing things like, how can I create a more efficient drug? How can I begin to grow organs as replacement, as opposed to making full clones? How can I look at having them available at the right time? What is the speed of cloning? Do I have to clone in advance and hold it in stock and maybe freeze the organs until I need them, cryogenically freeze them until I need them? Or is it something that I can grow and deliver just in time, just like just-in-time manufacturing? So, a lot of thoughts going around into that and what we can do with that. The other thing that is really interesting to me about that is that we're seeing more and more, even states in the United States, passing legislation against this. For example, 10 states in the United States, Arkansas, California, Iowa, Louisiana, Michigan, North Dakota, Rhode Island, Virginia, all have penalties for scientists trying to do human cloning. And the United Nations has given a statement on cloning. They wanted to do a binding statement. It ended up becoming a non-binding statement because of disagreements between the nation states. But you're seeing that very much put in place. The other thing that is really there is we are now developing using some of our more advanced supercomputers and our movement towards quantum and biological computing, the ability to simulate, as Rob was saying, more and more of what we've learned through physical cloning. And that is going to open up whole new areas of science. My bet still is looking at therapeutic cloning, because I can see that. I mean, if I had kidney disease, I would love to have a spare kidney cloned for me that has zero rejection, versus the challenges you have when you take a organ from someone else with the tremendous anti-rejection medicine you're giving, and the harm that actually does to the rest of your body as well. It becomes a lifelong commitment to take those. That to me is the biggest use coming up. We're going to see, I believe, some uses of trying to use other elements of the body as starting points for cloning. You know, you heard embryos used for a while. Most of the therapeutic cloning today uses tissues from your skin built around skeletons, platforms, to be able to grow from there and be built that way. Increasingly, it's being able to be done instead of in vitro, like a lot of the cloning was in the past. It's being able to be done externally in these controlled scaffold environments, and that's a huge advancement as well too. But the whole practice has gone through tremendous changes in the last 10 years. And the next 10 years should be very exciting as we begin to look at it. And I believe in the nations, in some of the nations that where there are not prohibitions against science around human cloning, we will see attempts and tremendous advances, like I said, in the next 10 years. It's hard to start a cloning science centers, a cloning lab, a cloning clinic from scratch today. But the digital tools there are surely there. It looks like many of the therapeutic tools are there. We're seeing techniques adopted from many other industries pulled in to help this process too. We're seeing technologies like graphene actually used as part of this, creating the sculpting processes, the scaffolding. And as Rob said, the modeling simulation, the digital twins, is being applied heavily in this area right now. Oh, it looks like we've really lost Sharif. So that's, I think, Rob, what I can say right now.
Sure, yeah, Sharif's long gone. So one of the real promises we're working towards is this idea of being able to blend biological cloning and digital cloning into a combined science. And the reason why you'd want to do that is if you can create highly accurate digital models of something, you can not only reproduce it, say 3D print body parts, but you can also do your testing in the metaverse as opposed to the real world. Now, imagine that in the case of a virus where you've got a pandemic or potential pandemic coming forward. Rather than going through the biological testing, which is rapid as it is, still takes weeks, months, sometimes years to do testing. And the last go around, we were able to speed up the creation of the antivirals using supercomputers, looking at existing data. But you could probably come up, well, I shouldn't say probably, you most certainly can come up with a better antivirus quicker, more quickly if you could test in the metaverse, because the metaverse operates at machine speeds. And we're already seeing the benefits of the metaverse in terms of the creation of autonomous vehicles, and that the autonomous vehicles were able to advance in a series of years, what many of us thought were going to take decades to do. And that was because they were able to do on-road testing, years of on-road testing in a matter of hours. And if you want to see how the vehicle is going to perform in a blizzard in Las Vegas, and while the weather's been changing a lot so far, we don't have blizzards in Las Vegas. You can't do that in the real world, but you can do that in the metaverse. And so with medical testing and understanding, you can act in the metaverse. In fact, you could train doctors much more effectively in the metaverse with digital clones than you could with people, because often when you're training doctors or surgeons, you're working on cadavers, or they're assisting in a real surgery, which can be problematic if they make a mistake. And with cadavers, you're not worried about the patient dying; the patient's already dead. So in a metaverse environment, you can introduce in surgery all kinds of different events. Say the patient is intolerant to anesthesia, or like me, comes out of it way the hell too early. Rather than having the doctor the first time that occurs panic on the operating table and maybe create a mistake, they experience that much like a fighter pilot does in the metaverse in terms of learning how to fly other planes. They experience in the metaverse, so any mistakes they made are made virtually, not with a real live person, and they learn from those mistakes and advance, and they become better surgeons going forward. More important, you can if you create the metaverse, then telemedicine becomes much more viable, in that you can have the doctor first operate on one doctor operate on an individual with some type of repetitive injury, say something like correcting male pattern baldness, for instance, which is kind of a repetitive procedure that happens for everybody. I had hair transplants myself, and a robot did much of the procedure on me, but the parts of the procedure it couldn't do that humans did could have certainly been developed in the metaverse and then applied to the robot. So then I could have a robotic surgeon with a much higher level of tolerance than a human is capable of. In other words, instead of the surgical cuts being close to perfectly accurate, they would always be perfectly accurate, and yet the doctor would still be able to oversee, would be able to test the procedure in the metaverse first, and then the robot could do the procedure, taking into account what it learned from the robot, and then do it at scale. That once that procedure was learned, for everybody else that came after that, the robot could probably do it without surgeon supervision, or after a period of time when the medical facility became confident that the robot could perform the procedure. And we have massive shortages of surgeons right now in certain areas, particularly in elder healthcare at the moment, which is creating an opportunity for automation to address that shortcoming. Because while most people, I think, would prefer a human doctor over a machine doctor, if you get a choice between a machine doctor and not having the surgery to begin with, and if it's life-saving surgery, you probably would compromise that particular requirement in order to get the surgery done and have a better chance of living. The other thing is with regard to certain progressions, if you're able to create or duplicate the human body, then you could potentially better anticipate problems. So say for instance, if you're able to create a digital twin of a child at a young life, and then keep that digital twin sync, much like we were doing with digital twins of equipment. We create a digital twin for a piece of equipment. We put sensors in that piece of equipment, and those sensors inform the digital twin as to what changes have occurred, and that allows us to do proactive maintenance, preventative maintenance on the equipment to prevent some kind of an outage. Well, with a human digital twin, we could do the same thing. We could create a digital twin of a child. The child becomes instrumented, and that digital twin remains consistently linked to the child. And as the child ages, so does the digital twin. And then we can run tests against the digital twin to see if and run metrics in terms of tolerance. And if the child starts falling out of tolerance, which might indicate cancer, might indicate some other debilitating disease, might indicate a hereditary problem, a genetic problem, then it would first identify in the digital twin, and then we could advance that digital twin to adulthood to see what type of correction would have the greatest benefit to the child's overall life. So in some cases, it might be a prosthetic, because it's less risky. In other cases, it might be a cloned organ. In some cases, it might be a full-on replacement, depending on the budget, depending on the resources available, and depending on the outcome of whatever the operation would be, because we'd be able to simulate the outcomes, and based on that, be more informed on the procedure we applied. More important, the patient can look at this and say, okay, here's what we could do. We could provide you with, robotic legs or something, and actually take them through what the experience would be like in the metaverse. And we can do the robotic leg thing. We could do that, tomorrow, or we could clone a set of legs for you, and that might take 5-10 years to create the clone legs. And this is what your life would be, and wouldn't have to be mutually exclusive either. You could have the robotic legs and the clone legs already. That with an extreme cost, but here's what your life would be like 10 years, 20 years from now with either of them. And you can make the determination whether the extra cost of the clone legs would be worth getting them replaced, or maybe you just, hey, the robotic legs are fine and I'll live that way. So maybe able to make much more informed decisions as far as medical procedures, because you would see the underlying outcome. And with regard to risks, every procedure has risk. You go to the doctor and says, we're going to do this procedure and the side effects are this and the potential side effects are this. Well, with a highly accurate digital clone, you could come back and say, rather than 20% chance that the side effect would be bad, you could say, well, in your particular case, that there won't be any side effects because we test this digitally. So now the chance of side effects is 0.2 instead of 20%, or they're 80% instead of 20%. And that would again inform your decision of whether or not you want to take the risk. And so you would become more informed as a patient. Certainly doctors would be more informed as far as the advice they're providing. And much of the testing and challenges would occur on your digital twin, not on your own body. Now, that does still bring up the issue with regard to what the heck happens to that digital twin. But as long as it's staying synced with you, so it's a representation of you in the metaverse, then it's just like your shadow. You don't really worry about the ethics of your shadow, the citizenship aspects of your shadow, or the rights of your shadow. But we're never going to go there. And this digital twin would just be a much more accurate shadow of you. It would be emulating every aspect of you. It wouldn't have its own personality. It would simply be you. Now, the interesting part of this is what happens if you die. Now, if you're still linked, the digital twin dies, but it wouldn't have to. And unlike real life, your family could decide to resurrect your digital twin, and you could continue to live as you last were, as long as somebody paid for that hosting service that maintained your digital twin. Now, I doubt that would be cheap, because the amount of memory that it would take to maintain and processing power that it would take to maintain the digital twin would be relatively high, but it would only need to be active when somebody wanted to interact with you. So from a digital twin standpoint, their life would be a series of events where they interact with your offspring and your heirs for 10, 20, 30, 100, 200 years, as long as it was viable. And so that particular resource would mostly be storage. It wouldn't be processing. And you'd only be active in those moments when somebody would want to be interactive. But wouldn't it be fun to be able to have a conversation with your now past father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and just get a sense for the kinds of things that they experienced in their life? And if you're facing with a particular difficulty that they might have faced, might be something you might want to have a conversation with them, or just better understand your roots. What were they dealing with back then that would better frame the kinds of problems you're having today and give you a different perspective? All of those things are possible with that digital twin. But the big thing is the ability to be able to test medical procedures and concepts in the digital world without doing it in the physical world. It would be faster, arguably much safer, and creates a path to a kind of immortality that could be viable without the biological problems that physical immortality would have in terms of infrastructure issues, citizenship issues, and rights, which we would have when we're talking about a robotic twin or a biological twin that exists in the real world.
Rob, along those lines and everything, I just popped into the conversation. I know that Sharif was trying to get me to come in, but I was actually producing a couple of other shows for Pod TV. Yeah. But you raised a couple of things that were curious to me and everything, because there is a 47 or 46 year gap between me and my nephews, because my brother was a late life father and all along those lines. So if I was to, and like I said, we all have mortality. So if I was to pass away and all along those lines, would the digital twin be existing that is me at say this age at 61 and all along those spaces and all in that line, would that be the digital twin that would be having the conversation with my nephews if they were to make it to, let's say they make it to 61 and all in that space? Because like I said, they're 14 and 15 at this particular time. So would they be talking to Mark, the 61-year-old Mark, when they turn 61, or would they be talking to Mark that would then be 100 and something, all along those lines? So how would the notion work? So would they be like, let's say something was to happen to me next year or the year after, would they be talking to the version of me that exists now when they get to that age, or would they be talking to a version of me that is continuing to age as well?
Well, so if the digital twin is created like I articulated, in other words, it's created when a person is a child and it's grown over the years and advances, there's nothing to say they couldn't dial it back. So in other words, if they wanted to talk to you at the end of your life, the way you were at the end of your life, they could, but they could say, well, I want to talk to them. I'm 16, I'm 16, 5, 70, 80, whatever years the end of life is for you. That's long. I don't really want to talk to an 80-year-old because they won't relate to me. I want to talk to him at 16. They could do that. They could simply dial it back, take the image as you were at 16 and have a conversation with you. Now, even if the digital twin was created late in life, you could apply software knowledge to the digital twin. In other words, you could, one of the issues is, okay, let's say it's 100 years from now and you want to talk to your great-grandfather. You're probably not going to have a lot of that digital twin probably not going to have a lot of context. I mean, you say, oh, you know, I got up today and I got into the pressure, and 30 seconds later, my boss wanted to talk to me, and my digital clothes weren't quite ready. And you at 80 are going, what the hell is he talking about? But you could update the twin with current knowledge, be able to allow that digital twin to continue to exist going forward against other digital twins. And we're creating digital twins all the time. So and Earth 2 is going to be a digital twin of the planet. So you could allow it to continue to live and exist throughout that environment, and then still dial it back. I say, okay, I want to talk to Mark Lee, my uncle, with all his knowledge, but I want to talk to him as if he was a 16-year-old like me, not an 80-year-old when he died. And I want to talk to him as if he understands what's going on today and can relate to what I'm doing. So he's got this life knowledge, but I want him to have current knowledge, but I also want him to understand what I'm dealing with as a person. I've got hormonal stuff that he's not dealing with. I'm chasing girls. He's not doing that anymore. I'm having difficulties figuring out what's important. I want to talk to the Mark Lee that will understand the problems I'm having, not the Mark Lee that won't understand the problems I'm having. And the AI could create that construct. Now, to be clear, it probably won't be as you would have been had those things happened, but I don't think it's going to matter to the individual that's asking the question. It'll be close enough for them to get a sense of whether or not you're helpful at that age or not. And even if you're not, the AI could adjust the program so that it comes closer to what the individual wants to see, not necessarily what reality would have provided. That would all be within the parameters of being able to change the construct. So for instance, if and this is probably where we're going to see most of this early time, say for instance, you wanted to date Raquel Welch. There's a digital twin of Raquel Welch. The digital twin of Raquel Welch, of course, today would have to be created from her movies, but that'd be all right because that's the Raquel Welch you want to date. So then you're digitally dating in the metaverse Raquel Welch, and it wouldn't be anything like if you were actually dating her, but you wouldn't care because she would be doing everything that you'd want to do with her. She would be that perfect Raquel Welch from your perspective, and so you'd be just fine with that. Now, Raquel Welch, if she was still alive, would probably say, "Yeah, I don't necessarily want that to be happening," but being dead, she doesn't get a vote. So which is probably one of the reasons why actors don't strike at the moment. They're a little bit concerned about some of this stuff.
They're concerned about folks doing that, and I can definitely see that thought because definitely somebody might want to date with, and she is still alive, Halle Berry, and that might not be the digital version of what Halle is like and all in that space. And, you know, there have been certain celebrities that have had all kinds of issues that have gone on in their dating life. So then the question becomes, are you going to get the perfect version of, say, a Halle Berry, or are you going to get the Halle Berry that had issues with David Justice and his sex addiction and some of the other things that she has gone through as well? Because definitely we all go through our life changes that are based on our experiences with folks. So is that, because, you know, there's this notion in relationships of don't bring the baggage with you, but the digital twin might actually be bringing the baggage with them, or they might erase the baggage.
you could turn it off. I mean, the thing is, you could, if you want to have a conversation with Halle Berry, you could do that. If you want to have a conversation with, say, the Halle Berry that was in the James Bond movie, you could do that too. And you could use data. And this is probably an issue that we're going to have to deal with as a society. And one of the reasons why the porn industry just loves this idea of digital twins at the moment is what are the rights that are attributed to the person living or dead whose digital image has been borrowed. Now, some of the actors have gotten behind this and said, okay, what we'll do is, when I'm gone, you can license, and my heirs will get the money for their license. And what you do with it, I may care about, I may not, but that'll all be detailed with regard to the license, the limitations. And of course, my heirs, my estate will make sure that this stuff is done properly. We do that with books today. If somebody wants to do a movie about Edgar Rice Burroughs movie, you're not asking Edgar about it anymore. He's long dead. You're asking his family. Basically, you're asking his estate if you can do it, and then that gets translated into a film. Some of the films that are built around Edgar Rice Burroughs books probably should have remained on the
Yeah, we've even seen that in music as well, because Michael Jackson has been dead for a number of years. Prince has been dead for a number of years. I imagine that even though he just recently passed away, there is a whole movement around people that were Jimmy Buffett fans and the whole parrot movement. And I'm sure that there will be entire concerts around Jimmy Buffett, even though Jimmy Buffett won't be there, but there will be a hologram or a image of Jimmy Buffett that will exist that will bring that Jimmy Buffett parrot head experience.
Remember, we had a while back. We had a concert where they had the hologram of Prince performing at the concert after post-death, and that created a bunch of people. Well, what I really want. I mean, do I want my work to go on after I'm done or not? And that's a decision you make. Right. But it may be a decision that's made. It may also be a decision that's made for you. It really depends on the dynamics that occur at the time. So, for instance, say if India suddenly wanted to create John Wayne movies. But John Wayne's estate may not have a lot of say in what India does with John Wayne's image. And if they do, well, maybe the movie gets created in some other country that doesn't have a close tie to. Maybe Russia creates it. I mean, right now, I don't think anybody can tell Russia what to do.
Yeah, I don't think Russia would do that. But did we see that with a bunch of the Chinese movies? Because I remember that there was a time that the Chinese movies that were made in China were having these very bad dub versions and everything. So like I said, if you're a martial arts fan, you might have enjoyed the movie for the martial arts. But if you are a fan or knowledgeable of the language, you were sitting there going like, that's not what he said. And that's not what he said at all, because a lot of the dubbing was very bad. And you could tell that the dubbing was bad, even with the way that the lips were moving versus what was happening.
But here's the issue: is say you have a Chinese movie with Chinese actors, and you want to market that Europe or the United States. Why not digitally replace the actors' faces with actors? Now you've got Halle Berry, John Wayne, Bruce Willis, and certainly people are going to come see that. Granted, the U.S. would probably block that movie in the U.S., but the black market for that movie would go vertical. Oh, yeah. As we've certainly seen with black market versions of movies. Remember that early on we had the issue when movie theaters were not allowing you to have tapes of the movies. The black market for movies just went absolutely vertical, and then they came around to the idea, well, maybe we want to sell these things at a reasonable price, and that kind of curtailed the black market activity. But the chance to use this to create black market activities, and as I mentioned before, the chance to use this nefariously to either create a false representation of a person, a politician, positively or negatively, could be absolutely problematic. I think the DeSantis campaign is running videos right now of Trump kissing what's his name, the guy that our virus czar on the head. Yes, yeah. On the which he never did, so all done with deepfake. So that's not even a full clone. That's just a deepfake, a visual accurate representation. Imagine what you could do with somebody that was a digital clone. And do understand there are some interesting things you could do with digital clones that we'd have to watch out as well. Because the digital clone, let's say a crime was committed, and you've been instrumented, and your digital clone has been tied to you directly. Well, you don't have to. You played the fifth because you don't want to incriminate yourself. Well, how about your digital clone? Can your digital clone plead the fifth, or could the police just grab that digital clone and have it tell the friggin' truth because they've got access to the underlying code, and it because it was tied to you, would know absolutely whether you did it or not.
Hey,
So
Rob, that raises a whole other issue because there were two major criminals that got away. I think one was in England recently. The other one was actually there in Pennsylvania, and he actually climbed the barbed wire and everything. But if there was a digital clone and you had digital clones and we all had digital clones, does that mean that if the criminal element commits the crime, does the digital clone go into the prison cell with them? And wouldn't that add to the overcrowding? Because if we've got both the inmate and the digital clone, we're already complaining that we've got too many people in jail, and that could double the jail cells and all along those lines. So that's a whole nother issue.
Well, the digital clone exists in the metaverse. There's no physical site for the digital. But let's take that as an example. Say the individual that escaped had the digital clone, and you wanted to figure out where the individual went. You'd simulate. You put the digital clone. If it's still tied, you know exactly where the individual is because the instruments would tell you it is. But let's say you severed the instruments, broke out, took all the sensors off, so not on them. You could still simulate where that digital clone is likely to go, and with a high degree of accuracy, come down to at least a very small region where the digital clone likely is, given the fact, depending on the accuracy of the environment the digital clone was operating in. So you could just and you could also run simulations to see if people were likely to commit crimes. I remember we had a movie like that with Tom Cruise where they were the precogs where they were able to arrest people for crimes that they hadn't actually committed yet, crime prevention as opposed to punishment. And it's an interesting concept because you, in theory, could do that with digital clones. You could determine that if somebody was likely to commit a crime, and while I don't suggest arresting them before the crime is committed, you could certainly convince them not to commit the crime in the first place. So you could mitigate without necessarily incarcerating. In that case, you would actually lower the incarceration rate because punishment-based systems don't work all that well for emotional crimes because people create emotional crimes like murder based on emotions. They're not thinking of the consequences. They don't think of the consequences after they're done, and they try to cover up the crime. If you could better predict the likelihood of murdering somebody, you could mitigate the activity, put protections around the individual likely to be killed, or contact the individuals likely to do the killing and say, here, if you go through with this, you're going to end up in prison. And by the way, we put everything in place we can think of to keep you from going through this. So, cool down, calm down, and because here are the repercussions, and you could actually prevent crimes without increasing.
But Rob, how would you deal with that in the same case? I just had the pleasure yesterday just because I was up late and was bored, so I was listening to TEDx talks, and one of the TEDx talks was a sex worker, and part of what she was saying, because you're trying to talk about the rights of sex workers and the need for the right for sex workers, was the fact that a lot of that work is because of financial things that are going on, and even that is an issue within the third world. A lot of crimes like that are in Cambodia and Thailand and a number of things in that lane, and they are doing it because it is a way to get out of poverty. It might not be the greatest way to get out of poverty, but it is a way to get out of poverty, and that was her argument for legalization and a number of other things that she was advocating. But I was wondering, how would that work in the digital clone? Would we be able to teach people that this might not be the best way, whether it's drugs or whether it's sex or a number of other things that people get into? Because I would argue that the vast majority of crimes are crimes of economics. There are crimes of passion. There are a number of other kind of crimes, but I would say the vast majority are because people are in a financial pinch, whatever that financial pinch is, and they are trying to find either an escape, which is why drugs are very big, or they're trying to find a way to get the money to buy groceries or a number of other things.
Well, but digital twins it's an expensive technology, so it's unlikely it's going to migrate down to people that actually would need it at that level anytime soon. Mostly that digital twins will be created around those that are wealthy, and for the reasons we discussed earlier. However, you can certainly imagine a criminal, rather than getting an ankle monitor, might get a sensor suite that would better be able to determine if they're a continued risk to society. So you could, for somebody that continues his test as no risk, you don't put them in jail, just they're limited as to what they can do, and their imprisonment is they're 100% monitored. And that can be a cheaper way to deal with the problem than incarcerating them. And assuring that they are doing what they're supposed to be. They don't have to call into their parole office or anything like that. The digital connectivity takes care of that. But if they get near a school, they're a sexual predator, they go anywhere near a school, or even if they seem to be looking at material that might get them to do that, that immediately flags and remediation is put in place. Now, David Smith's got to run to a Zoom call, so we've got to pass over to David to say his final comments before he leaves.
Yeah, and I'll also try to reach out to Sharif so he can hopefully end us all and all along.
Yeah, I've got a meeting to run to too.
Yeah. I agree, Gadesh, from to Sharif. And it is one that there is certainly controversial around part of the world. But if you think about the 3 different types of cloning, it gives you an opportunity to look at them in a scientific approach. Human cloning, still a ways off. But with all the new tools we have, the new capabilities, it's probably only a matter of time to see that happen in one of the countries where it's allowed. So, guys, thank you for letting me be part of this. I do have to jump on to another meeting and look forward to working with y'all later. So thank you all.
No problem. And I'm reaching out to Sharif as well, because I know I got to do a couple of calls, and I know you do as well, Rob. I guess the question I've got really quickly while I reach out to Sharif is, and it comes down to what he is part of, which is this research out of Bangladesh. And you actually kind of alluded to it. Isn't a lot of this conversations that we're having about human cloning very much of a Western notion? Because I don't know that anybody in Brazil, unless there's a well-to-do in Brazil or in Bangladesh or Malaysia, are going to have this technology anytime soon. I mean, the same thing was said about the cell phone, and now it seems like everybody, including other people in third and second worlds, have cell phones and all along those lines. But it is something that those people that are in developing countries, it won't even be a concern of theirs, say, for another several decades, because it's probably going to be the Elon Musk and the Bill Gates that will be able to afford the human clone in the immediate future.
Well, so it really, when we're talking about human cloning, it's less about the technology and it's more about where you'd be allowed to experiment with it. And in some of the emerging economies, their restrictions on human cloning are substantially lower than any place else in the world. And in many ways, because enforcement is also often low in an emerging economy, even if there were restrictions against it, it's likely you could still get it done without a lot of troubles, making sure it wasn't very visible, and much easier to get away with than you would in a developed nation. So the opportunity for a third party that needs this work done, and understand big pharma is a huge industry with billions of dollars behind it, and being able to create clones to test against would be a far cheaper and far more effective way to do testing, human testing, than on live people where you've got a lot of liability risk. And animals where you introduce inaccuracies due to the genetic differences of the animals. So there was no doubt in my mind in some of these countries this is already going on. It just nobody's talking about it. And there's a lot of reason to not talk about it, because there's no real upside to talking about it. You don't, and even if it's relatively legal, you don't want to get the religious community coming after you if you can avoid it, because your headquarters might be in the United States and you're doing the research that's someplace else. So maybe you're already there, but the religious side is going to go after you domestically where you're headquartered, which would be problematic. So there's really no doubt in my mind it's actually happening now. It's just a question of it's just not very visible at the moment. So some of these environments are conducive to it because of the politics and religious influence in those environments.
Yeah,
less science, but they could develop as a result a core competency. And once that core competency is developed, and things change over time, and restrictions drop, suddenly now everybody's going to them for the technology because they've developed that core competence, and not going to their own local resources, because those resources were blocked for too long and are unable to come up to speed. So there are huge opportunities when you've got religious restrictions on scientific advancement.
Yeah, and we had a late night discussion on cloning me and Sharif, because he was trying to do a couple of those. He did one last night on something that I'm not all that an expert in the sense of knowledge of IoT security and everything. But that is one of the things that we talked about, was that notion of the religious leaders, because a lot of the religious leaders are not the biggest fans of clones, because it comes down to that whole question of morality and the soul, and whether the clone has
a monopoly on creating people. This really comes down to their thought. If man can create man, then why are we? And it brings into question the entire concept of a God. So I understand religion's being self-protective here. If man can do what God can do, then does man then become God? And religion doesn't want to see that. We're clearly progressing to a point where we're doing. I think it's I read a piece the other day that said we've got 18th century morals, we've got 20th century concepts, and godlike technology. This is going to end really badly. We haven't advanced as a race as far as the technology has advanced us, and that's what's creating many of the problems we have today. But it's a whole different discussion.
There's a whole different discussion, and turn it over to Sharif. I am glad to know that whenever my end comes, and like I've said before on this show, I'm trying to personally root for 200, even though I know that's not humanly possible, that my nephews can learn about me playing Pong when I was about their age and everything, because I think it was around 14 or 15 or 16 that I was playing that early video game, which was basically just a ball trying to break into a wall that existed on a TV set. So it was a very basic of videos, games, and all along those lines. But they can learn me, they can have conversations of why that is a much better game, or maybe a much worse game than the Oculus that they currently have. So it's good to know that they can have that conversation, maybe even as us both as 16-year-olds when they are 36 and I'm in my 80s and they are in their 30s and all in that space. So we can have a conversation at that point, reminiscent as our 16-year-old selves.
Absolutely. All right, Sharif, wind us up.
Thank you. Thank you. This is great discussion. Thank you, Professor Rob, and thank you, Mr. Martley, for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Take it easy.